Hello and welcome back or welcome to the channel. Today I want to throw my two NFTs into the ongoing debate on master modes that's been stirring up the SC community in recent weeks. Yesterday I listened to a great podcast by my friends Space Tomato and Avenger One, and I found it really thought-provoking. And while I respect that A1 has a far better grasp of combat fundamentals than I do, I find myself not quite agreeing that there is anything terribly wrong with master modes in principle. Personally, I think it's a combination of other things that are missing from the game that are holding back the flight model, and mean that the meta lacks depth when it comes to combat. So in this video we're going to explore these factors and discuss how, as they develop, more balancing and tweaking of the existing Master Mode's flight model should hopefully start to make sense. So if this sounds good to you, grab a cup of tea while I roll the intro, then let's get into it. As is tradition by now on the channel, before we get too far into the weeds, I'd like to make a small disclaimer. I am no combat ace. I enjoy a lot of the combat aspects of the game, and I dip a toe into the waters of PvP, but I'm very much a generalist when it comes to SC. If I do have to lean one way or t'other, then I'd probably do so more towards the industrial aspects of the game. What I do think I can bring to the table is experience from other MMOs, and the outlook of an org leader in Star Citizen. I run a sizable org, Frontier Consolidated, and while I very much enjoy the game as it is now, we do always have an eye on the horizon, thinking about what a more finished live release is likely to involve, and what goals we're likely to set out to achieve as an org. Coincidentally, if you would like to get more involved with multi-crew type gameplay, you'll find a link to our community Discord server down in the video description below. I think in order to frame this debate a little bit better, it's worth taking a few moments to step back and outline what CIG was setting out to achieve with the introduction of Master Modes. And probably the best place to source that is an ISC episode, Masters and Blasters. I'll include links to any videos I referenced down in the description as well. The key goal of the devs was to simultaneously bring the speed of combat engagements down, allowing flights to occur at a slower pace without all the boom and zoom that was happening before, while still maintaining the option to achieve high speeds that were necessary to traverse such a big game area. The type of combat the devs want to see in the game occurs best at SCM speeds, a couple of 100 meters per second. But in a game where you frequently have to travel hundreds of kilometers without necessarily using the quicker quantum jump mechanics, you still do need to be able to push up towards the 1000 meters per second mark to make that bearable. So the basic solution is Master Modes. One mode, SCM, allows you to use all your weapons, shields and countermeasures, but caps you at the lower speeds, while another, Nav, lets you achieve higher speeds as long as you trade off by losing access to the aforementioned ship systems. And when it comes to the issues that are being raised by the community, I would strongly encourage you to also watch Avenger One's recent video on the subject and the podcast that he had with Space Tomato, again links down below. In the interest of time, I'm going to try and paraphrase the basic arguments, but obviously something will probably be lost in translation. As far as I follow, the core issues stem from firstly, the speed at which maximum speeds are hit. The maximum speeds have been adjusted down when in SCM, but the thruster acceleration is still roughly where it's at in a pre-323 flight model. So nimble ships like interceptors will hit that top speed incredibly quickly and then cap out all of a sudden, making the whole thing feel quite jarring. Secondly, the changes haven't really led to any improvement in the multi-crew situation, with smaller fighters, since they represent a smaller target, and particularly for the interceptor class are the quickest and most manoeuvrable, being best able to just kite out larger opponents, stay out of range and out DPS them. And thirdly, that the damage model, combined with the relatively lower element of skill in terms of getting shots on target, mean that pilots are in a much more straightforward DPS race, skewing the meta towards ships with a combination of speed and the highest levels of burst DPS, the Buccaneer for example. All of this is adding up to a model whereby there is a lower skill ceiling, meaning that player skill expression matters less, and where the meta is increasingly rigid. However, as I alluded to in the introduction, I don't personally think that these are master modes problems. I think these are overall game balancing problems, and therefore I don't necessarily believe that master modes needs to be completely scrapped or reworked, and we might run the risk of judging the system far too early in its development. I personally believe that when CIG talk about archetypes, it hints that they're heading for something of a rock, paper, scissors class-based meta, where no one ship is just the GOAT, and all types of ships have strengths and weaknesses. A little while ago I made the first episode of a series, Fleet Logic, which I'm really looking forward to resuming. In that I outlined different classes of ships, and what they theoretically should be strong and weak against in a fleet-based combat system. Capital ships should be your flag carriers, capable of deploying smaller ships to a flight, bringing heavy firepower, perfect against other large, slow behemoths, pretty much impervious to light fighters due to their heavy armour, but absolutely terrified of enemy bombers. Fighters should pretty much just be ignoring the big cap ships and corvettes since they can't damage them, instead focusing on taking out the enemy fighter screen since they'll be similar in terms of manoeuvrability, especially intercepting and dealing with those enemy bombers before they get close enough to light up your cap ships. The issue here is that not all of the ships are even in the game yet. One of the reasons I held off making any more episodes of Fleet Logic for the time being is that I at least want the RSI Polaris in-game to represent a meaningful flagship for when we try to test things practically. So I would say that taking issue with the current game balancing, while absolutely fair, is a little bit premature. There are certainly a lot of steps that could be taken in the short and medium term to make larger ships more competitive with smaller ones and lead to just a better game experience for now. First and foremost, I think we do need to see ship armor ASAP. Personally think that the size of weapons found commonly on fighters like size 2s and 3s simply shouldn't penetrate the armor of, say, a hammerhead. They should be able, if they can brave its guns, to assist in taking the shields down, but when it comes to the hull, they should pretty much just splat harmlessly against the armor. And speaking of the guns, I would love to see a buff to turrets in the short term, improving turret traversal speeds and aim assist, to make them more consistent when targeting smaller ships, and balancing weapons so that the turreted ships tend to have range and projectile speed advantages over fighters. Some specialist anti-large ship fighters like the Crusader Ares obviously occupy a different space in the meta, and they should maintain advantages over these large ships. But again, I don't think we should be talking overly about this ship versus that ship, and should be thinking more about NVN style fleet engagements. If your group brings nothing but hammerheads to a battle, you might have a really groovy time if your enemy brought nothing but arrows, but suffer if you come up against a more diversified fleet that includes things like Ares or bombers that can deal with your anti-fighter corvettes. A blessing and a curse when it comes to Star Citizen is just how wide the appeal of the game is. Don't get me wrong, I think it's absolutely fantastic that we've got flight sim enthusiasts rubbing shoulders with FPSers and MMO nerds, but it can lead to some occasions where we as a community are at odds as to what we want from the game. I've personally always been more on the MMO side, and while I appreciate that the flight model is more immersive than, say, Starfield, I've never really had a strong desire for hyper-realism. I always thought hyper-realism, when taken to the nth degree, would just make for a really boring game. I'm also conscious that, in an MMORPG, sometimes simpler mechanics are actually better. If things get way too complex at the micro level, it can become nigh on impossible to achieve any form of balancing in the game, and reward groups who organise themselves and field balanced raiding comps. I'm a massive fan of melee fighting games, for example, and while in an arena setting I prefer the complexity of a game like Mordau, that complexity wouldn't translate into an open world MMO setting as well as, say, the relative simplicity of Last Oasis's melee mechanics. When there's a lot of other stuff going on, coordinating with teammates, holding formations, making sure that you deploy people with the right weapons to deal with the right enemies, etc., it sometimes makes for an actually better game experience when you don't have 20 different ways to swing your sword. And with that in mind, I would also highlight another thing that I think is just missing from the current combat discussion. What are we fighting over? Because what you're fighting over is going to determine how you fight. Right now, with 100 player servers and a relatively vast area to play in, the chances of organic PvP in Star Citizen are pretty slim. We have run relatively massive industrial operations, salvaging or mining oriented. With a combination of industrialists and combat security, I can count the amount of times our security forces have actually had a real threat to deal with on two hands. Organic PvP is most likely to be small scale and highly asymmetric. It will be acts of piracy, where a group in combat ships target a solo player or small group in a hauler, or it will be a bounty hunter with a meta build PvP ship sneaking up on me while I'm doing Vaughn missions in my PvE meta Connie. Not that I'm salty whatsoever. Much more plentiful is instanced or arranged PvP, either through the Arena Commander module or through players agreeing to meet up and duke it out in the PU. And however it comes about, there is something clearly missing from these fights, a clear contested objective, and an incentive behind holding that objective. The goal is more often simply to win the fight, to progress your own skills, and to walk away with the bragging rights. These are perfectly fine things in themselves, but they're not exactly quote-unquote realistic combat scenarios. You aren't fighting to hold an objective, you don't have any real pressure to get there first, and there's no real advantage gained if you win or lose. There is one key event, Jumptown, that does encourage groups of players to come together and vie for resources in a somewhat more realistic way. Ultimately, this single event suffers from two key issues. First, it's just been run so many times now that the gameplay has naturally become a bit stale. And secondly, the objective isn't really worth fighting over. The payout of taking and holding the facility is simply credits, and compared with other game loops which involve less risk, it doesn't pay enough to incentivize large groups of players to fight over it. Hypothetically, if holding JT was the most valuable thing you could do in the game, then you would probably get carnage every time it ran. But in the game that is to come, I hope that we have a multitude of varied objectives to contest with one another in PvP and with NPCs in PvE combat modes, and that the outcomes of these fights actually matter, where we have meaningful rewards that can give a victorious group a significant advantage to walk away with. And these objectives should offer varied gameplay experiences that reward different fleet compositions. Some may occur in open space and be a playground for heavy-hitting capital ship fleets, while others could be more atmospheric and reward groups that are able to bring fighter-heavy compositions to the battlesphere. One thing I do think Master Modes does really well is forcing players to commit to a fight, lessening the ability for people in zippy little ships to pop in, test the waters by popping off a few shots, and then run away if things appear a bit too hot for them. If we assume that most well-prepared fleets in the future will include elements of tackling to prevent navving out, and that anyone not properly screened on their way out of a fight would continue to leave themselves incredibly vulnerable, then we get to a point where those looking to contest an objective will need to make a decision to either commit to a fight and see it through to the end, or turn tail and run if they aren't confident. This will all lend itself to good dynamic contesting of objectives. Furthermore, proper objectives should reward logistical prowess. I'm really looking forward to the asteroid-based missions shown in a recent ISC, and I could see these procedurally generated missions as a perfect mini-objective for orgs to contest. And here, when you don't know where you're going before it happens, being first to an unknown location would represent a massive advantage, since it would give you time to get entrenched. So individually, something like heavy fighters like the Vanguards might be outclassed by light fighters like the Gladius, but their bigger fuel tanks and faster jump drives are a huge advantage when it comes to getting into position on the objective first. So while some players may feel that Master Modes have taken away a huge degree of player skill, I think there are other aspects of player skill that will be rewarded in the future, and provide some counterbalance to this narrative. So all in all, my personal opinion is that we should wait and see with Master Modes and combat in SC in general. I don't believe there's anything inherently wrong with the concept, or with the goals that CIG are setting out to achieve with the system. And I do think that as time goes on and more elements of the game come online, we can get stuck into the weeds of balance, something that's likely to be an ever-evolving concept and debate for as long as the game's around. As ever, I would be very interested to hear your views on the subject, so please do let me know down in the comments below. But while I appreciate that it is a very contentious topic, if you can't approach it without typing in all caps or calling someone else stupid, then that does sound like a you problem, not an us problem. If you enjoyed the video and you think I earned it, then I would of course truly appreciate a thumbs up and if you would hit subscribe. We'll be back next week with something completely different in the form of a cargo guide, if I can ever work my way up that rep ladder, so do stay tuned for that. But for now, I'd just like to say thank you very much for watching all the way to the end, and I look forward to seeing you next time.